Good evening. It's June 20th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome all of you watching to our weekly webcast on LaRouchePAC.com. Mr. LaRouche is recovering from a minor medical procedure tonight, so he will not be joining us, but I am joined by Dennis Small of Executive Intelligence Review, Keisha Rogers, former candidate for Senate in the state of Texas and leading member of the LaRouche Policy Committee, and Megan Beats from the LaRouchePAC Basement Research Team. We all just had a short discussion with Mr. LaRouche immediately preceding this broadcast, in which we presented to him the questions that would be asked and received his response. So the answers that you will hear tonight will reflect what Mr. LaRouche had to say. So we will start, as we normally do, with our institutional question, which was presented to Mr. LaRouche earlier this evening, and I will ask Dennis to respond to it. It reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Min Shu, recently warned about a dangerous housing bubble building up in a number of countries, from Great Britain, Belgium, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and the Philippines to China. In Canada, for example, home prices are 33% above the long-range average in relation to incomes, and housing rentals are 87% above long-range averages. The bursting of the housing bubble in any country in Europe, the United States, or China could trigger a major global financial crisis. How do you propose to solve this looming disaster?
Thanks, Matt, and good evening. Mr. LaRouche's answer to this question began by saying, that's not the problem. The problem is what the United States is refusing to do under the current global strategic situation. What the United States population is refusing to do, what the United States Congress is refusing to do, and the fact that since the crime of Kennedy's assassination, the correct path has not been taken by this country. It has not been addressed. The country has gone down in terms of its physical economic collapse, regularly, consistently, and now at an accelerated rate. And the entire transatlantic financial system is in the active phase of a global blowout. Mr. LaRouche said that the issue is, when will you act? Because people have got to face the facts. The facts have all been put on the table. There's no more a question of questions to be asked. The only issue is, when will the answers be implemented? He said we can, if we take the proper measures, immediately establish a solution to this crisis, bring the world back from the brink of a global breakdown, bring the world back from the brink of a threatened thermonuclear war, which the British Empire is threatening to unleash, along with a global collapse. We can and must get rid of President Obama from the presidency by constitutional means as the principal obstacle in this country to the policies that need to be implemented. And what has to be done, very simply, is to implement the four-point program, or the four laws which Mr. LaRouche has presented as the necessary policy for this country to move forward on immediately. And what I would like to do, simply to get immediately to the point on this, is to read you from Mr. LaRouche's most recent paper on this matter, which is called Not an Option, an Immediate Necessity, the four new laws to save the USA now, those 4 points. Point number 1, the immediate reenactment of the Glass-Steagall law instituted by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt without modification as to principle of action. Point number 2, a return to a system of top-down and thoroughly defined as national banking. He says that the successful model for this was that which was successfully installed under President Abraham Lincoln's superseding authority of a currency created by the presidency of the United States, to wit, the greenbacks, under the control of the Office of the Treasury Secretary of the United States. Point number 3, the purpose of the use of a federal credit system established under such national banking is to generate high productivity trends in improvements of employment with the accompanying intention to increase the physical economic productivity and the standard of living of the persons and households of the United States. This is to come, he specifies, by technologically advanced innovations and developments at the frontier of science designed to increase the energy flux density per capita and per square kilometer of economic territory such that the productive powers of labor are so developed. And he says that what is behind this is the necessity of ensuring the ceaseless increase of the physical productivity of employment. Point number 4, adopt a fusion driver crash program. The essential distinction of man from all lower forms of life, hence, in practice, is that it presents the means for the perfection of the specifically affirmative aims and needs of human, individual, and social life. And such a fusion driver crash program is premised on the concepts elaborated by the great Russian scientist and philosopher Vladimir Vernadsky, whose concepts Lynn summarizes in the concluding portion of this paper, and which we will also discuss further ahead in tonight's discussion. Those are the 4 points Mr. Larouche stressed, which can be immediately implemented at this point, because the entire system is otherwise completely gone. And he asks the question, why is the transatlantic culture collapsing when the Asian Pacific culture is on the rise? Why have we tolerated this? Why have we permitted this to occur? He said specifically, buddy, the stink has gone too far. It's time to act to turn this around. Why is Obama not out? 3/4 of the population of the United States hate him. There's new polls that have been issued which show that his negative rating on foreign policy is the worst in the history of all poll taking. How is it possible under these circumstances that the American population has not acted through its established forms of government for the purpose of removing Obama from office? We have all of the scientific evidence. It's all before us. The problem, Mr. Larouche stressed in today's discussion, was that the United States has repeatedly violated its own principles. We have violated the principles that we didn't understand or chose not to understand. Ever since the murder of JFK, we have gone on that slope downwards and we have not turned it around. Now today, we face the greatest collapse ever. And the basis for turning it around is correcting that flaw in our national culture which has existed since that time, and to immediately implement, around LaRouche's leadership, this 4-point program. Mr. Larouche also stressed that that 4-point program, that policy direction of the United States, will unquestionably find broad, nearly universal support internationally. He said we can set up an international system immediately. And I think the developments, which we'll hear a little bit about further on, of the Schiller Institute conference celebrated last weekend in New York City, give the interesting political picture of exactly what the shape of that international coalition of forces is. So today we face a situation where the world financial system is totally blown out. There are $1.7 quadrillion in financial aggregates and counting. There is utter desperation on the British imperial side to somehow or other maintain control over this exploding system, and thus their drive to war before the whole thing gets out of their hands. In Europe in particular, there is a desperate situation as reflected in the fact that the International Monetary Fund, for example, has demanded that the European Central Bank has got to get on with some serious quantitative easing. But underneath all of this is the established British policy of bail-in. That is to say, a ratchet down, a dramatic implosion under the control of the British Empire, they would have it, in which what is sacrificed is only 6 out of 7 billion human beings on the face of the earth. Their intended policy of depopulation is the result of the bail-in policy, which means taking it out of the hide, taking it out of the standard of living, taking it out of the basic forms of existence of the population through things like what happened in Cyprus, what happened in Detroit with the robbery of the pensions, what happened with Obamacare, where the health of Americans has taken a drastic reduction, what is happening with the assaults on the teachers' union and the pension systems, and so on and so forth. And that is why they're driving at the rate they're driving. That is why the war danger is there. And that is why the United States has got to immediately break from this policy, turn towards the Asia-Pacific. The basis is there to do it, and the programmatic emphasis of this thing is established with Lynn's four-point program as just immediately identified.
Now, at the beginning of this week, a very dramatic process was set off inside Great Britain. This week began with an editorial that was published in the Daily Mail by that paper's senior correspondent named Simon Heffer, titled, "Impeach Tony Blair. As Iraq burns, Parliament should put this deluded liar on trial." Heffer asserts that Blair must be immediately subject to impeachment proceedings by the House of Commons for the lies that he told leading into the Iraq invasion of 2003. After thoroughly detailing the procedure for impeachment under the British system, which he stressed could end in Blair being sent to prison, Heffer details the charges which Blair should be tried for. He says, "Did Mr. Blair know that he was lying to Parliament when he presented the dodgy dossier, which argued that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed against the West in just 45 minutes, and therefore gain Parliament's authority to go to war on the basis of a deception? Is he therefore responsible for the 179 deaths of British service personnel, never mind the tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians who died in the conflict? Above all, has he damaged the interests of this country by creating long-term instability in the region because of a decision that was either criminally negligent or possibly taken on a fraudulent basis?" And Heffer goes on to state at the end of his editorial, "The irony is that Blair's justification for war was the presumed threat to this nation from Saddam Hussein, a threat which never existed. Yet now, in the blazing ruins of Iraq, which are the legacy of that war, British jihadis are fighting with the Islamic forces, butchering their way across the land." Now, immediately after this editorial was published, George Galloway, an MP, a member of the House of Commons, did precisely what Heffer was calling for, and filed articles of impeachment against Tony Blair, thus beginning the process which now starts with the creation of a special select committee in the House of Commons to review the impeachment charges. And at the same time, another MP, Sir Peter Tapsell, the so-called father of the House of Commons, the most senior member, confronted David Cameron on the floor during leaders' questions and demanded to know whether he agreed that the procedure of impeachment should now be activated to bring Mr. Tony Blair to account for allegedly misleading the House on the necessity of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Also, very significantly, an interview was published this week with a Cambridge professor, a Mr. George Joffe, who's the former deputy director of Chatham House and one of the advisors that was sent to advise Tony Blair on the consequences of the original invasion of Iraq in 2003. And in the interview, Joffe says that Blair has, quote, "a shallow mind," and that Blair bears, quote, "total responsibility for what is now occurring in Iraq." Now, I'm sure that people are very aware of what is occurring in Iraq. The ISIS forces are savagely sweeping across Iraq, leaving indiscriminate carnage in their wake. And what's becoming ever more clear is that ISIS is directly being financed, funded, and supported from none other than Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There's an increasing number of articles that detail Saudi Arabia's role Josh Rogan in the Daily Beast authored an article called America's Allies Are Funding ISIS. And today, Andrew Klein published an article called Saudis Are Arming the Jihadists That Are Seizing Iraqi Cities. Now, as we know, Barack Obama has been directly responsible for continuing the Bush-Cheney cover-up of the Saudi role in 9/11, suppressing the classified 28 pages of the 9/11 inquiry report. This is the subject of House Resolution 428, which is sponsored by Walter Jones, Stephen Lynch, and Thomas Massey, as well as Obama's direct interventions on the side of the Saudi kingdom in lawsuits that have been brought by survivors of 9/11 and their families against Saudi Arabia. And thus, Obama has allied himself directly with the greatest state sponsor of terrorism on this planet at the behest of the British Empire. This crime alone is one for which he should be impeached. And now we see him flagrantly announcing his utter disregard for the Constitution by announcing that he does not need to ask congressional approval to send troops to Iraq, which he has already begun to do. And this is undeniably an impeachable offense, as has been emphasized in Walter Jones's other bill, H. Resolution number 3. Today, the author of the original 1973 War Powers Resolution, Paul Finley, said, "Just as with the threats to attack Syria last year, an attack on Iraq would violate the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution. As with any president, President Obama is committing an impeachable offense if he does not follow the Constitution." So, with that said, I guess the question would be, with Blair now being impeached, can Obama be far behind?
No, not far behind. That's exactly the issue that we have to bring about. Blair is a very interesting person. First of all, well, I don't know if person is the right word to use, but we'll let that one go. First of all, he answers directly to the Queen. Secondly, Blair has been the hands-on controller not only of the Obama administration, he was, after all, the 2012 advisor to the Obama presidential campaign, but he was also directly involved with an advisor to the various Bushes, 1 and 2. This is one of the most visible, evident, and transparent chains of command from the British Empire into the traitorous forces existing in Washington today. People will often respond to Mr. LaRouche and say, well, what British Empire? I don't see any British Empire. How can you talk about the British Empire? Why? That hasn't existed for decades or centuries. Well, look at what's happening with Tony Blair. Look at exactly what has gone on with this thing. This is the guy who, in addition to being a controller and advisor to Bush Cheney and to Obama, who played a direct role in establishing the British imperial policy of destruction of the nation state and population reduction in his famous 1999 Chicago speech, where he laid out that we must now enter the post-Westphalian era. That is to say, get rid of the concept of a world governed by nation states, each sovereign in their own domain, in relationship for the betterment of each other. And instead, we go into the Hobbesian world of everyone at war with everybody else, where sitting on top of the whole thing is Leviathan, i.e. the squatting British Queen herself. Now, that is Blair's policy. That is Obama's policy today. It is a violation of the Constitution, and it is intended to drive the world directly into thermonuclear conflict between, on the one hand, the United States and NATO, and on the other side, Russia and China. Russia and China. That is the actual portent of what is happening in Iraq. Now, let me take a step back and ask you to take a step back with me and take a look at what has happened. 10 days ago, on Wednesday, the 11th of June, nothing special was going on in Iraq, apparently. On Thursday, the 12th of June, which is 8 days ago, all of a sudden, apparently out of nowhere, seemingly for no known reason, for those who are following sense perception in their noses, all of a sudden Mosul was taken. And what blew up on the world stage was a situation which, in rapid-fire order now, has taken us to the very brink of a superpower confrontation with the United States under Obama about to launch yet another war, again illegally, again under the direction of Tony Blair. Now, this tells you a couple of things. One thing it tells you is that Vernadsky is right when he says that space and time are not factors which exist outside the existing universe. They are a creation of man's activity. The pace of developments is extremely rapid, and that's because of processes which man, in this case, unfortunately so, has unleashed. The second thing it tells you is that Lyndon Larouche, over the last 20 webcasts where you've heard him on Friday evenings, has been absolutely spot on right when he has said that the Ukrainian crisis and the potential for a war with Russia has nothing to do with Europe, has nothing to do with Ukraine. This is not a Ukraine war. This is not a European war. This is simply an expression of the British Empire's intention of launching thermonuclear confrontation globally, and that is what is behind it. And that is, in fact, what is behind Iraq as well. This did not come out of nowhere. It came out of the Queen's lap. Hold your nose. And that is why we have a situation where the world has been brought to the brink yet again in this front, in addition to the Ukrainian front, of that kind of showdown. Now, there's, of course, not only the fact that Obama and has been sponsoring and backing the Saudis, and the Saudis are financing ISIS and training ISIS and arming ISIS and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of evidence as well, which must be the subject of a congressional inquiry, as to the direct United States role in financing these activities itself, as in the case of 9/11, because this all goes back to the Saudi role in the act of war on September 11, 2001 against the United States of America, which was covered up by Bush Cheney and again covered up by Obama. So this has deep roots. Now, what's the game plan here of the British? How do they think they can get by with this type of operation? Look at the situation that Russia faces in Ukraine today. The British are trying to present the Russians with only two options. Either sit back and take it and see a fascist coup occur on their borders, with a fascist color revolution sweeping into Russia itself, which the Russians have already explained very clearly in their May 23rd conference. They understand what these color revolutions are all about. And to tolerate this kind of development, or to respond militarily, so the British would like to set the trap, and to then establish the pretext for an escalation into thermonuclear war. And they're trying to get the Russians to think tactically, that is to say, stupidly, to think with their noses, to see what's only in front of their nose. And as Mr. LaRouche has stressed repeatedly on this show, President Putin of Russia has to date responded in a very thoughtful, strategic manner at each point, looking for and finding ways to not fall into the trap, to flank the situation, and to deal with it otherwise. Just in terms of one of the updates around Ukraine, just to get an idea of how grave this situation is, with the new president, Poroshenko, coming into office there, besides the escalation of the warfare against the anti-Kiev federalist forces in southeastern Ukraine, Poroshenko has announced that on June 27th, he is going to sign the second and final part of the agreement with the European Union for economic relations, which essentially means the total takedown of the Ukrainian economy has occurred with countries like Greece, like Spain, and so on and so forth. In effect, what he has said is that Ukraine is going to walk willingly into the concentration camp, which is the European Union and the Eurozone today. And it is a concentration camp. These are exactly the same fascist policies which were implemented under the other British creation back in the 30s and 40s, which was Hitler's Germany. And so in exchange for joining up with the EU, Poroshenko is going to be given a certificate by them which basically says, "Welcome to Auschwitz." And this is what Russia has got to deal with and look at under these circumstances. Are there, in fact, only two options? Now look at Iraq. We are being presented, the American public, with a brainwashing operation in the media telling us there's only two options here. Either we sit back and allow al-Qaeda and worse terrorists take over the entirety of the Middle East and not doing anything about it, or the only other option we have, we're being told, is to get involved in a war and in airstrikes against the very al-Qaeda operations which this administration, under Tony Blair's direction, has helped to create. Are those the only two options? Is that in fact the case? And this is what always happens with the British strategy. You're told either submit or engage in a flight forward response strategically, which will only further their objectives. Now, excuse me, what is true strategy under these circumstances, which Mr. LaRouche has discussed over and over again? To not think tactically, but to think strategically. It's not simply a question of thinking on larger terms versus smaller terms. It's a question of kicking over the chessboard. It's a question of not accepting the terms of the discussion. It's a question of defining a battleground and a terrain which the enemy doesn't even know exists, because you define it based on that unique human capability of creative reason and find a vulnerability, an Achilles heel, where you can kick them in the butt, kick them in the nose, and bring them down completely. Now, I'll give an example of this from 30-odd years ago, but I think people can draw their own conclusions about the current situation. Back in 1982, when the British laid a trap, typical British trap, for Argentina around the Malvinas War, and a war was launched against Argentina over the control of the Malvinas, Mr. LaRouche was the only political figure in the United States, the only statesman who sided with Argentina on the issue of their sovereignty over the Malvinas, in terms of the history, in terms of the Monroe Doctrine, in terms of John Quincy Adams, and in terms of the idea that we don't need the British meddling in the Americas to reimpose colonialism. The Argentines at the time consulted Mr. LaRouche and said, what do we do? How do we fight this? Can we win this war? Why, we think we can, we have exosets, which we're going to get from, these are cruise missiles, we're going to get from different countries and so on and so forth. How do we do this? And Mr. LaRouche's response was, well, one often does have to take such measures, but you are in possession of a superweapon. You're in possession of a weapon which is so strong that it can bring down the British Empire entirely. And that weapon, he said, is the debt bomb. He said the British Empire is totally dependent, as are their Wall Street allies, on the existing financial system. The purpose of the Malvinas operation was to establish out-of-area NATO deployments for debt collection. You want to destroy the British? Sink the financial system. Get allies to do it. Drop the debt bomb. Now, that concept of the debt bomb originated with Mr. LaRouche, but it was later picked up, almost a year later, on the front page of Time magazine, which you can see on your screen, where in January of 1983, they had a cover story. They discovered the debt bomb. So whenever people tell you, oh, you can't do that, oh, that's not possible, there's only a pragmatic solution to this, we can't do anything so dramatic as impeach Obama, oh, no, we can't actually drop the debt bomb, oh, we can't go with those 4 points, that's not practical. That is the sign of someone who has already capitulated to the British. They say they haven't, they may even feel that they haven't, but they have. Because the most powerful weapon that the British Empire has is to get their intended victims to think like the British. That is to say, think like Aristotelians. Think in terms of tactics, not strategy. Think like beasts, as opposed to thinking, the way Vernadsky points out, human beings are uniquely qualified to think, which is creatively. And that, I think, is the actual subject matter and story behind this very interesting development of a breakout in Britain, as there is also a breakout in the United States, of total opposition to this current British imperial strategy. Leading it to victory depends on what Mr. LaRouche has established, in particular in terms of his four-point program.
Now, as I said earlier, we have the privilege of being joined in the studio by Keisha Rogers, former candidate in the state of Texas for the United States Senate and leading member of the LaRouche Policy Committee. Down in Texas, Keisha forced a historic runoff vote against her multi-millionaire Wall Street hack opponent. Keisha was up in New York City this past weekend as one of the keynote speakers at the Schiller Institute's 30th anniversary conference. And since then, she's spent the entire week conducting literally back-to-back meetings in Washington, D.C., with over 24 offices in both the House and the Senate, including with several members of Congress themselves, many of whom had been personally following her campaign and greeted her with a profound and genuine sense of respect. Now, for other members, her presence was almost like Banquo's ghost, haunting them with the guilt of their own cowardice and compromise, especially on the issue of their failure to act thus far on impeachment. And Keisha was not afraid to tell those members to their faces, look, you and I both know that you're just a coward. So the presence of her moral authority on Capitol Hill set a standard which sent shockwaves across Congress. Now, Dennis just mentioned some breaking developments that I want to just go through a little bit, and then I want to ask Keisha to come up to the podium and speak. But there's been a flurry of a open congressional revolt against the Obama war policy. This is yet to take the form of the introduction of an impeachment resolution, which is the only thing that will actually work. But there are a few very interesting bills and amendments that have been introduced just in the last 48 hours. Now, an interesting pair, Michigan Democrat John Conyers and Florida Republican Ted Yoho, introduced a amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill yesterday, prohibiting the transfer of man-pads, or these shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft missiles, to the rebels in Syria. And this amendment passed by a voice vote. This was underscored by remarks on this subject saying that Congressman Conyers pointed out that these man-pads can end up in the hands of terrorists who would then use them to take out Western targets, especially against airliners. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a California Democrat who is the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Peace and Security Task Force, introduced 4 amendments to the Defense Appropriations Bill. The first one was to block all funding for sending ground troops into Iraq. The next one was an amendment to prohibit funding pursuant to the 2002 authorization for use of military force, essentially repealing the George Bush 2002 authorization for use of military force. And then the next one was a similar amendment to essentially repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which pertained to actions in Afghanistan. And then finally, Democratic Congresswoman Representative Hannah Busa of Hawaii, who's a member of the House Armed Services Committee, introduced a amendment that stated that no funds shall be made available to be used with respect to Iraq in contravention of the War Powers Resolution, including for the introduction of U.S. armed forces into hostilities in Iraq. And this resolution passed by a voice vote yesterday. So, Keisha, Keisha, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit on the reflections that you've had from your meetings in the past week in Washington and what you think are the necessary marching orders that have to be implemented for everybody who's watching this broadcast.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Well, I think that we can look at this process and really take from Mr. LaRouche's understanding of how a process of history is shaped, and that what we're seeing right now is the fact that what is transpiring is cannot be looked at from the standpoint of a series of events unfolding one by one, but there's a total process underway, and that process has really defined itself with what I did with my campaign and what I set out to emphasize with this idea that we had to change the subject of discussion in politics in this midterm election, and that everything that had been put on the table in terms of what was business as usual and what had been adopted in terms of politicians who wanted to go along to get along and continue to go along with the current trends of economic or trends and policies has now come to a point where that can no longer sustain. And what we did with my campaign is to create the insurgency and the revolt coming out of the population, where business as usual, the establishment, Republicans and Democrats, were going to be taken on by the population. And you're seeing this explicitly with, you take what I was able to express to members of Congress as well as staffers that we spoke to, and as you said, we had about 25 meetings or so, was that one, this revolt that you're seeing in the population is coming from a population that is seeing that every bit of their well-being is absolutely being destroyed, and that this president is being protected, the Wall Street interest is being protected, and they've had enough of it. When you look at what has transpired with the crushing defeat of someone such as Eric Cantor, and all of the money that he had behind him, the Wall Street interest behind him, all of the Republican establishment support behind him, and he has his rear end handed to him in this election. And then you take that in line with what you see right now with the European elections and the revolt that came out of the European elections against the EU policy, against the bailout, the bail-in, the Troika policy, and against austerity, and that you had people who were winning their elections in France and in Italy and elsewhere that were really demonstrative of a total shift in this current current paradigm. And also with my campaign and what we did with our LaRouche Policy Committee, LaRouche Democrats running for the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, putting forth the only solution on the table, which is that there is no other option now to defend and save the Constitution and save the commitment of the United States to the citizens of our republic, except for getting this president out now, who has been, and impeaching Obama now, who has been in total violation of the Constitution. And as we're seeing, that situation has come to a point of never-ending destruction. And what more and more people are starting to realize is that this is their lives on the line, that we are going to lose this nation if the institutions of government continue to go along with the capitulation to this collapsing system, the bail-in, the bailout system, the entire collapse, as Mr. LaRouche has said, of the transatlantic financial system. And I think that really it's important to look at, why are these events unfolding right now? Why are you seeing this insurgency? Why are you seeing this revolt? Well, it is these things in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the opposition to leadership is really a product of the understanding and people coming to understand that we're at the end of a system. This whole financial system is disintegrating, that the entire transatlantic system is a total rejection, and the transatlantic system in the direction that it's going right now, on behalf of a British Empire, on behalf of a Wall Street, London financial interest to destroy the sovereignty of nation states, is not what our U.S. Republic represents. And that has been something that has been really taken away from Americans and their understanding of what the real republic is, but it's something that is rooted and embedded in them that cannot be taken away. And so you're seeing that the American population, the fervor in the American population is, wait a minute, this is not the real America. And it is our obligation as citizens of a republic, of what President Lincoln defined as of, by, and for the people, to act to defend that republic. And so what you're seeing right now is a total commitment to understanding that this old paradigm is now coming to an end. And there is now time for a new paradigm. And the new paradigm has to be based on a new commitment and vision for restoring what this American identity truly represents. And that can only be defined in, one, the immediate implementation of LaRouche's four laws and his 4-point plan. That now is the time that more and more Americans are starting to see that there is a solution, that they have the obligation to fight for that solution. They have the commitment constitutionally to fight for that solution, and are making it very clear to Congress members and leaders within the establishment that if they don't get their act together, they're going to be out of there. They're going to be impeached, removed, and that there's going to be a real understanding that the people are going to take charge again in actually determining what is going to be our destiny and what's going to be our future. And so let me just point out a couple of things. In a lot of these meetings that I was able to attend, first of all, more people understood, many of these staffers and Congress members really understood the implications of what we had done in Texas, and understood that this was a national fight that we had led to give them members of Congress who had their necks stepped on by the Wall Street, the financial interest, and the establishment, to give them a freedom to now break free of that so that they can actually come out and fight. But also to recognize that the business as usual policy and population going along with the current trends and actually accepting their Congress member, capitulating and selling them out, was not going to be tolerated anymore. The fact that you have 7% approval rating, 7% approval rating and dropping of this Congress, and that people are talking about this is election time. Well, first of all, they're starting to realize that elections are not going to mean anything if you are selling out your population when they see that we're headed toward the brink of total destruction, toward the brink of thermonuclear war, and that they see that Congress members are not fighting for their interests, that these Congress members better look at what happened to Eric Cantor, and look at what's going on right now with the opposition coming out to the call for impeachment of Tony Blair, and look at what happened with my campaign forcing a runoff election against a multimillionaire and against the Democratic Party, who put everything out to put a stop to my campaign, and at the same time creating a total opening in the current economic and political trend that the situation that is before us immediately shows that the population is absolutely committed to demanding a change in this current policy, and a fight, and putting forth a real fight. And so let me just reiterate, the marching orders right now is that we have to continue to put some strong demands and pressure on Congress. We have to continue to reiterate that this president must be impeached now. This president is not acting on behalf of the American people. He is acting on behalf of Wall Street, the British Empire. The policies are murderous, and that if it is not stopped, that will, in essence, be the end of the United States and the end of the world as we know it. And so, one of the things that was really clicked in the minds of the people that we were speaking with is this idea that we as human beings do have the power, unlike any other species, above any other species, to overcome this current threat, and to actually overcome this threat by making the understanding that we as human beings can actually determine and create our future. That is what Mr. LaRouche is establishing in these 4 laws. Once we actually put forth the immediate reinstatement of Glass-Steagall banking reorganization, the immediate policy toward long-term credit as Lincoln and John F. Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt had used as a clear indication of their commitment to what Hamilton had set forth in our U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and as the driver for future orientation, as a crash program driver for the next 25 to 50 years. That is, when you think about what Mr. LaRouche's 4-point solution represents, that is the anti-war, the creating of a world without war. That is the essence of the commitment to how to solve the crisis that's unfolding now, how to actually give people a vision and a commitment toward a real solution to getting out of this collapse. And so I will leave with you with 2 things I think are absolutely important. One, I am calling on all citizens watching this webcast, and those of you who will be sharing this with your friends and family, to call your Congress members now. The more pressure these Congress members have, and the more calls that they have into their office, and to demand that, one, this president must be impeached immediately. I want to make the point, read something into the record, the fact that Matthew earlier spoke of Congressman Walter Jones, H-Con Res 3. And I just want to remind people of what this says. Just a very simple statement of constitutional intent, which is on the question of impeachment. And it says, expressing the sense of Congress that the use of offensive military force by a president without prior and clear authorization of an act of Congress constitutes an impeachable high crime and misdemeanor under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution. Goes on to say, whereas the cornerstone of the Republic is honoring Congress's exclusive power to declare war under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution, now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, that it is the sense of Congress that, except in the response to an actual or immediate attack against the territory of the United States, the use of offensive military force by a president without prior and clear authorization of an act of Congress violates Congress's exclusive power to declare war under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution, and therefore constitutes an impeachable high crime and misdemeanor under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution. That is a clear call to action to all Congress members. We know that this president is in violation and must be impeached now. You have to call your Congress member. Now is the time. Immediately demand H-Con Res 3. Immediately demand that this Congress start the impeachment proceeding now, and that we can move forward on the implementation of LaRouche's 4 laws, starting with the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall banking reorganization. And so that's what I will leave you with, and I think that the situation is ripe. The revolt coming from the population is a real indication that now's the time to bring about and bring in the new paradigm for mankind, which is absolutely past due. Thank you.
So this will be the final question of the evening. I'd like to get back to the theme of Vladimir Vernadsky, which you raised in the beginning, Dennis. On May 29th of this year, there was an important conference held in Moscow at the Presidium of the Russian Academy of Sciences. It was the International Scientific Conference on Problems of the Sustained Development of Mankind in the System, Nature, Society, Man, at which Mr. Lyndon Larouche was invited to give the keynote address. The conference was held in honor of the 90th birthday of the late chemist, philosopher, engineer, and great friend of Mr. Larouche, Pobysk Kuznetsov, who had hosted Mr. Larouche in 1994 on his first visit to Moscow and remained a great friend and collaborator for the rest of his life. Now, in his address, which was delivered by video, Mr. Larouche addressed the crucial importance of the work of Vladimir Vernadsky for overcoming, Keisha, as you just addressed, for overcoming the era of warfare among nations. Now, on an even higher and, I think, subsuming level, he addressed the importance of the work of Vernadsky for understanding the unique role of mankind as the only willfully creative species in the universe as we know it. The only species which actually has the ability to cause his own upward evolution. Now, this event and address was followed a couple of weeks later by the memo, which was read at the beginning, not an option, an immediate necessity, the 4 new laws to save the USA now. Now, in that memo, after laying out the 4 points, Mr. LaRouche returns to the theme of the work of Vernadsky. And in the section following the 4th point, Vernadsky on Man and Creation, Mr. LaRouche writes, V.I. Vernadsky's systemic principle of human nature is a universal principle, which is uniquely specific to the crucial factor of the existence of the human species. For example, time and space do not actually exist as a set of metrical principles of the solar system. He then says, since competent science for today can be expressed only in terms of the unique characteristic of the human species' role within the known aspects of the universe, the human principle is the only true principle known to us for practice. The notions of space and time are merely useful imageries. He then, near the conclusion, writes, man is mankind's only true measure of the history of our solar system and what reposes within it. So what I'd like to ask you is if you could elaborate on why the discoveries of Vernadsky are so indispensable for defining mankind's future today.
Well, that's a little bit more ambitious than I think we can deal with in the few remaining minutes, but I do want to give the beginning of an answer to that question, perhaps, in raising some of the questions that Vernadsky is posing, some which will hopefully titillate you into further studying him. It is worth noting from the outset that the intended master of ceremonies at that celebration of Boris Kuznetsov that you were talking about, who couldn't be there because of other responsibilities at the time, was Sergei Glassiev, who is an advisor to President Putin. The same Sergei Glassiev who did send a message of greetings, which people can find on the LaRouche PAC site and also on the Schiller Institute site, to a conference held last Sunday in New York City on how to create a world without war, which is exactly the issue which Mr. LaRouche addresses in terms of the important principles that Mr. Vernadsky lays out. So this is altogether fitting and proper that this kind of intellectual collaboration should be going on. And suffice it to say on that point that the intention of the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp LaRouche, in calling for this conference, among other things, was to present to the world who look to the United States the other America, that it is not simply what you read in the newspapers, that you actually have a broad movement against war, represented at our conference by people such as Ramsey Clark and Ray McGovern and former Congressman Neil Gallagher and current and recent state legislators and senators Andrea Boland, Dick Black, and others, and also forces who are calling for the Glass-Steagall point, which is the first of the 4 points, as Keisha was just emphasizing. For example, Thomas Buffenbarger, the head of the International Association of Machinists, and others. So that you have the intellectual structure of ideas necessary to solve the problem, exactly as LaRouche has been insisting. There are no more questions, really. Though they're valid questions, to be sure. There's plenty of questions, such as those posed by Vernadsky. But the answer is clear on the economy as to what needs to be done. And I ask you simply to reflect on the view that people outside the United States, whether it be in Russia or in China, whether it be in Argentina or in Nigeria, have of the United States with or without the LaRouche factor. Just think that through for a minute. What does the world look like to you if you're sitting in the Kremlin and wondering what in the world you're going to do, depending on what it looks like in terms of what Mr. LaRouche has uniquely put into motion inside the United States? And I think that should be, among other things, an interesting intellectual exercise and also an important spur to further action. Because everything that we do in the United States, the marching orders which we've just received from Keisha, are marching orders that will be multiplied 100-fold and 1,000-fold around the world to the degree to which we succeed in implementing them. Now, on the specific question of Vernadsky, which you raise, the Mr. LaRouche's formulation in this piece is really very interesting about time and space not existing independently as metrics of the universe. Because Vernadsky discusses the different spaces and times that exist in what he defines as three domains of existence within the known universe, coexisting within a single universe, but the domain of the non-living, the domain of the living, and the domain of the not merely living, but of what he calls the noetic, that is to say, man and man's creativity. And he explains in his discussion of the latter, of the noosphere, as he describes it, that man's mind and the activities generated by his mind produce the evolution of the human species in a way unknown in any other species. That it is our ideas, the power of our mind, which creates the circumstances in which our species can evolve and must evolve upwards, the way in other cases occurs merely perhaps biologically. This has everything to do with the issue of space and time. He says, for example, if you look at the non-living, the abiotic, in comparison to the living, the space that they exist in is not the same. It has different characteristics. And one of the things he says quite emphatically is when you look at living matter, in particular, living processes, it is emphatically not a Euclidean space. That is to say, not a space with arbitrary axioms that are brought in from the outside that apply a metric to a process which is actually living. And he says, and this is one quote that I want to put on the screen for you, the first quote, where On the States of Physical Space from 1938, Vernadsky says, "As soon as we approach living natural bodies, we encounter a fundamental change in the geometric phenomena, which, it seems to me, does not fit into the confines of Euclidean geometry of any number of dimensions." In other words, don't bother adding new dimensions to a flawed premise. It ain't going to work. And then he adds further on in that same document, he says, "Bodies of living matter," and this is the second quote, "are fundamentally determined by the geometric state of the space they occupy, which differs from the Euclidean space of the inert natural bodies of the biosphere. This space cannot be Euclidean." And subsequently he discusses that the only proper approach to a space within which living processes could exist must be Riemannian. I'll leave that discussion to for a further occasion or for people listening in to the New Paradigm show. Then ask Megan to take that up along with other people. But the nature of space itself is different. And the nature of existence within that space is what determines and is determined by the characteristics of that space. I'll give you an example which Vernadsky throws out. Euclidean geometry, we're all familiar with straight lines, right? Straight lines are the shortest distance between 2 points and all of that sort of stuff. Are you aware of the fact that there are no straight lines in living matter? It's interesting. There are not. All living matter is distinguished from that which surrounds it, Vernadsky explains, by curved surfaces. Absolutely. There is no straight line. So how in the world are you going to try to superimpose a Euclidean geometry onto a process which has no straight lines in it, just as one example of this question of the nature of space? And then Vernadsky goes a bit further in a way which I find absolutely fascinating. He says, a living organism, and this is our third quote, a living organism cannot be completely reduced to physical and chemical systems we know. This very task may turn out to be as illusory as the problem of squaring the circle. Now, this is a direct discussion with Nicholas of Cusa. which is going on here. Because the idea that you can take an actually dynamic living process, which has totally different geometric characteristics of space, which is created by the process itself and is not imported externally, as in a Euclidean framework, has everything to do with the fact that you cannot possibly square the circle. That is to say, no matter how many sides to the polygon, you cannot actually generate curvature from straight lines. They are incommensurable. They're different. They're two species. They're two different forms of existence. Now, since we're talking about Cousa, what Cousa says about this is that the only way you know the physical universe that surrounds us is by your own mental activity of measuring it and knowing it. Measurement and knowledge is the same thing in his concept. He says mind is the metric of the universe. We know the universe by changing it. And what we are measuring is not some external object out there which exists in abstract space and time. What we are measuring is our own power to transform it. And that's all you measure. That's all you can know, is the power of reason, the power of man's ability uniquely to transform the space and time within which we exist. Now, with that posed in terms of what Cousa had to say, and this dialogue which is clearly going on here between Vernadsky and Cousa, let me return to the fourth quote of Vernadsky's that I want to present to you, where he talks about how this mind, this personality, creativity, actually changes things. He says, a great personality, whether a scientist, an inventor, or a statesman, can be of fundamental, decisive, directing importance and can manifest himself as a geological force. Now, this is quite interesting because it is in fact the case that man's development is the dominant force in biogeochemistry that surrounds us. But the question posed, and Vernadsky poses it explicitly, is if in this domain of the noosphere of ideas and of creativity, thought is actually the dominant power of that which exists, how can this be? Because if thought is neither matter nor energy, how does it affect material processes? And in the process of discussing this, he says that the energy which man can put into motion, in other words, man's power puts into motion different energy forms around him, and therefore can create growing, unlimitedly growing energy flux density, as LaRouche prescribes. That can happen precisely because energy so deployed by man is unlimited. And he says the real question here is the role of culture, the role of classical culture, the role of art, to understand how this causal effect of man's creativity actually shapes the universe around us. And I want to end with a final quote from Vernadsky, which is a composite from two different writings, but it all speaks to the same point. And I've put parts of that into what you'll see on the screen, but I'm going to read the fuller quote, which is the following. Vernadsky says, thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes? That question has not yet been solved, he says, writing in the mid-20th century. He goes on, the source of energy subjected to man's reason is practically unlimited. There is growing understanding that this increase has no insurmountable limits, that it is an elemental geological process. Creative scientific thought transcends the bounds of logic, including logic and dialectics in its various forms. He's writing in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. Transcends logic and dialectics in its various forms. And then, the world of artistic creation is not reducible in any meaningful way in any of its parts. Remember what he had just said about the living cannot be reduced to the non-living and have it make any sense. He's taking it a step further. He's saying that the world of artistic creation is not reducible in any meaningful way in any of its parts. For example, in music or architecture, to verbal representation. And yet it exhibits a great influence on the scientific analysis of reality. The control of this cognitive apparatus, little reflected by logic, is a task for the future. Now, this is Vernadsky's open question that he has posed. It's a little bit like Kepler's question answered by Leibniz on the question of the calculus. And LaRouche's discovery is, in fact, an answer to that question, because for those who don't know it, go back and look it up. In November 1993, LaRouche wrote a paper called On My Discovery, in which he begins by saying that his principal discovery is of the measurable impact of scientific and classical cultural activity on the productive powers of labor and of potential relative population density. In other words, that is at the heart of LaRouche's concept of economics, which is why he discusses Vernadsky in this 4-point paper, and it is the guiding thought behind these 4 specific 4 points that must be implemented now. This is the heart and soul of economics, this concept of man, which Vernadsky presents and LaRouche elaborates on and presents an elaborated concept of. And it is that concept and that concept only which is the actual solution to the crisis. The British are presenting a different concept of man. It's a concept of man which reduces him to simply accepting the 2 choices which the oligarchy gives him. Right? Poison or electrocution, your choice. We have democracy. You can choose. And LaRouche's answer is, sorry, drop the debt bomb.
That's going to bring a conclusion to our webcast tonight. I would like to thank Dennis Small for joining us tonight. I'd especially also like to thank Keisha Rogers for being here with us. And thank you very much, Megan, for joining me. So that's going to bring a conclusion. Please stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com. Good night.